Most people have this quiet assumption that the ocean is always the worst place to be. On land you might get chased, but in the water, something with teeth usually shows up that you never even saw coming. That pattern holds today, and it holds for most of Earth's past. Even in the age of dinosaurs, some of the most horrifying creatures weren't on land at all, but out in the seas. But there was one short slice of time where that rule broke. A window where for once the water was the safer option. If you were unlucky enough to be alive then, your best chance of not dying horribly was actually to stay in the oceans and avoid the land entirely. To find that upside-down moment, you have to travel back to the very end of the Permian period. We're in the last act of the Permian, in its final epoch, the Lipingian, and especially its closing stage. This is around 259 to 252 million years ago. Earth would have looked and even felt wrong to you from the moment you arrived. The moon was a little closer, which meant the planet spun faster. Days were not the familiar 24 hours you know now, but closer to 22. You would see more sunrises in a year, but each would be slightly shorter, giving the entire planet a strange, rushed rhythm. The continents were unrecognizable. Instead of the separate blocks we know today, most of the land had fused into a single titanic supercontinent called Pangaea. Africa, the Americas, Antarctica, India, Australia, and big chunks of Europe were all welded together into one huge landmass. If you walked across the heart of Pangaea, you could pass from what will one day be Brazil into what will one day be Namibia, without ever touching a coastline. To the east of this supercontinent, a few large island blocks escaped Pangaea's grip. One consisted of what would become Siberia, Kazakhstan, and North China. Farther south lay another island of future South China and parts of Southeast Asia. Even regions that are now welded into mainlands, like Turkey, Iran, and Tibet, were isolated islands surrounded by ocean. Those oceans had names that sound alien now. On one side of Pangaea lay the Tethys and the older Paleotethys oceans, wide inland seas that wrapped around the eastern margins of the supercontinent. But they were still dwarfed by the giant to the west. Covering well over 60% of Earth's surface was a single, absurdly huge body of water, Panthalassa. If you doubled the size of today's Pacific Ocean, you'd still be underestimating how big Panthalassa was. Flying across it in a modern airliner would not be a long-haul flight. It would be more than a day of staring at featureless blue with no land in sight. On paper, a world with that much ocean sounds like the worst nightmare for anyone with thalassophobia. You'd expect Panthalassa to be stuffed with monsters. But during this final stretch of the Permian, the seas were surprisingly underwhelming. The real horror show was not offshore. It was on Pangaea itself. By this point, sharks had already existed for hundreds of millions of years. If you've seen pictures of Permian seas before, you might picture Helicoprion, the spiral-toothed buzzsaw shark that has become the unofficial mascot of Permian marine life. Helicoprion could reach roughly 8 meters in length and carried a bizarre coil of teeth deep in its lower jaw that looked like a circular saw made of bone. The problem is, by the very latest Permian, Helicoprion was gone. It had vanished before this final stage, leaving only smaller relatives behind. Those relatives, belonging to the same broader group, rarely reached more than about 2 meters long. That's roughly the size of a leopard shark today. Their teeth show that they were specialized for soft, squishy prey like squid and other cephalopods, rather than armored fish or large reptiles. You wouldn't want one biting you, but they were not ocean-wide killing machines. Other shark groups, like various sphenacanthids and hybodont sharks, still swam in these seas. They were diverse, but most were small, closer to a meter in length. Think dog-sized sharks, not megalodon-sized giants. The famous sea scorpions, the Eurypterids, still clung on in a few places as well. In the Devonian, they had included formidable armor-plated apex hunters over 2 meters long. By the late Permian, there were only a couple of genera left, and none of them dominated their ecosystems. Across the board, almost every marine group felt weakened. That wasn't an accident. About 2 million years earlier, the world had been hit by the Capitanian mass extinction. The Capitanian doesn't get as much attention as the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, but it was brutally effective. By some estimates, it was more lethal than both the end Cretaceous extinction and the Triassic-Jurassic extinction when you look at marine diversity. Ocean life got hammered. Many trilobites, once iconic Paleozoic animals, never really recovered. Ammonoids and brachiopods survived, but in reduced variety and size. Reefs collapsed or shrank. Food webs in the water were thin and fragile. So by the time you arrive in the very last Permian stage, the oceans are strangely quiet. There are sharks, nautiloid relatives, ammonoids, and scattered invertebrate groups, but nothing like the stacked, multi-layered killer lineups you see in some other eras. The seas feel relatively tame. That's the only good news you're getting, because the moment you step onto land, the story flips completely. The Capitanian extinction had also struck life on land, wiping out a lot of big, early terrestrial vertebrates. But the recovery on land was fast and vicious. Instead of returning to what came before, ecosystems into something even more dangerous. Before the crisis, many of the top land animals were big therapsids, mammal relatives, called dinocephalians. These were heavy-set predators and bulky herbivores with thick skulls and powerful bodies. They ruled much of the early and middle Permian. The Capitanian event almost completely erased them. With the dinocephalians gone, a huge number of ecological roles suddenly opened up, and a different group of therapsids rushed in to claim them, the Gorgonopsids. Gorgonopsids were first described in the 19th century, and their fossils disturbed paleontologists enough that they named them after the Gorgons of Greek myth. That should tell you something about their vibe. They shared a set of distinctive features. They had long, narrow skulls with deep-set teeth. Their limbs were held more vertically under the body in a parasagittal gait, more like a mammal or a modern predator than a sprawling reptile. And most importantly, they carried elongated, razor-sharp canine teeth. In other words, they were among the earliest true sabre-toothed predators on land. At a glance, some species look eerily similar to later sabre-toothed cats like Smilodon. The resemblance, though, is purely convergent. Gorgonopsids were not cats. They were not even mammals. They belonged to a more primitive branch of the mammal line synapsids, closer to us than reptiles, but still very much their own thing. Early Gorgonopsids were modest in size. In the middle Permian, many of them were small, some not much bigger than a house cat or a small dog. They hunted little reptiles, amphibians, and other small synapsids. After the dinocephalians disappeared, that changed fast. With big herbivores now unprotected and large predator niches empty, Gorgonopsids began to scale up. Each new genus that appeared tended to be larger than the one before. By the late Permian, some of them had turned into multi-hundred-kilogram killing machines. The most infamous of these was Inostrancevia. Inostrancevia is often considered the largest Gorgonopsid we know of. Some specimens suggest lengths of more than 3.5 meters and body masses over 1,000 kilograms. That puts the biggest individuals roughly in the size class of a large modern bear. Most animals would have encountered smaller, only tiger-sized Inostrancevia, but the build was always imposing. It had long, sturdy limbs that gave it decent speed and endurance on land. Its skull was proportionally large, and the upper canine teeth were ridiculous. Each of those saber-like canines could be up to 15 centimeters long. They were curved, laterally flattened, and finely serrated along the edges. When that animal latched onto something, those teeth behaved less like daggers and more like serrated knives. Exactly how Inostrancevia hunted is still debated. One school of thought suggests a style similar to saber-toothed cats, powerful leaps or charges aimed at the throat, followed by deep bites that severed major blood vessels. Another idea is that it may have delivered slashing bites and then backed off, letting shock and blood loss finish the job. Either way, anything on the receiving end was in serious trouble. Inostrancevia fossils have been found across what is now Russia, but its relatives and close kin appear in parts of Africa and Asia as well. This wasn't a regional oddity. It was part of a broader radiation that spread across much of Pangaea. The environments it lived in were varied. Some fossils come from ancient floodplains with seasonal rivers and lush vegetation. Others come from cold, semi-arid deserts with only scattered patches of woodland. In those harsher climates, some researchers have even suggested that large Gorgonopsids might have had some kind of insulating covering, maybe proto-fur, although that remains speculative. If you somehow avoided Inostrancevia in Russia, you still weren't safe. Gorgonopsids as a whole diversified into dozens of species. In the European part of Russia, you would have met smaller forms, like Pravoslavlevia, and medium-sized predators, such as Suchogorgon. Between them, they occupied almost every carnivore niche above tiny insect eater. Further south, things were somehow worse. In what is now South Africa, a whole subfamily of giant Gorgonopsids evolved independently, the Rubigenes. While Inostrancevia holds the title for the single biggest known species, the Rubigenes were, on average, the most massive Gorgonopsid family. They were built like living battering rams. Their skulls were heavy and reinforced, lacking certain lightning bones seen in earlier forms. Tooth replacement seems to have been frequent, and their teeth were sharply and deeply serrated. Rubigia atrox is a good example. This animal prowled what are now South Africa and Tanzania, and could reach around 3 meters in length. Its skull alone made up more than 15% of that body length. Those skull bones were not thin. They show thickened ridges and bony bosses that hint at powerful jaw muscles and perhaps head-to-head impacts. Despite that, biomechanical reconstructions suggest its bite force wasn't enormous compared to its size. Estimated around 700 or so newtons, it was maybe only about 20% stronger than that of a modern wolf. What made Rubigia terrifying wasn't raw bite pressure. It was the combination of that bite with long serrated teeth and a body designed to wrestle large struggling prey. One Rubigene was bad enough. The problem is that the subfamily contained roughly 9 genera, ranging from medium-sized to giants, and they often overlapped in the same ecosystems. In the late Permian of South Africa, evidence suggests that Gorgonopsids like Rubigia shared their hunting grounds with big therapsids, medium predators, and sometimes even with Inostrancevia-like animals that had dispersed south. Multiple apex-sized carnivores were competing, clashing, and tearing into the same herds. This is why, if you drew a heat map of places you really don't want to appear in the Permian, South Africa and European Russia would glow bright red. On land, the late Permian was effectively the planet of the Gorgonopsids. And yet they weren't alone. Another therapsid group was rising in parallel, the Therocephalians. Therapsids also originated in the Middle Permian. They were widespread by the late Permian, with fossils found in Russia, China, Africa, and even Antarctica. A few species were herbivores or omnivores, but most were predators. At a glance, many therapsids looked like stubbier versions of Gorgonopsids. They had big heads and strong jaws, but their skulls tended to be broader and deeper. Their teeth were usually shorter and straighter. Their bodies were more compact, with shorter backs and more robust trunks. Because they were so diverse, therapsids experimented with a range of hunting strategies. Some appear to have been semi-aquatic, living partly in water and preying on fish and amphibians. Others were full-land predators using enlarged front teeth or small saber-like canines. Intriguingly, a couple of therapsid genera have been proposed as early venomous tetrapods. In medium-sized animals like Eucymbergia, grooves in the teeth and skull features around the upper jaw have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence for venom glands and ducts. If that interpretation is correct, these animals may have been delivering venom into their victims long before snakes ever existed. The idea is still debated, but it shows just how experimental Permian predators were. Among the therapsids, one of the clear standouts was Mascarinus. Mascarinus was roughly jaguar-sized in body, but carried a head closer to that of a lion in proportion. Its mouth was filled with sharp conical teeth. The enlarged skull suggests both strong jaw muscles and a powerful bite. Fossil evidence hints that Mascarinus likely used its forelimbs to grab or pin struggling prey, while its jaws did the real damage. It is one of the few non-Gorgonopsid therapsids that seems to have reached true apex predator status in some late Permian ecosystems. Even Mascarinus had a giant cousin, Megawatia, a distant relative, stretched to around 3 meters in length and prowled late Permian Russia during the earlier part of this final stage. Coprolites, fossilized droppings, linked to Megawatia, contain remains of large herbivorous dicynodonts, showing that it regularly tackled big prey. Some anatomical studies of its skull suggest the presence of structures that could have housed venom glands and delivered venom through grooved teeth. If that's right, Megawatia may have been using venom as part of its hunting arsenal, perhaps weakening or killing dicynodonts through bites that were as toxic as they were traumatic. Not everyone in the field is convinced yet, largely because the prey remains are fragmentary, but the possibility adds another layer of horror to an already frightening animal. All of this was happening on top of a background cast of other carnivores. Early archosaur relatives, such as proterosuchid-like reptiles, prowled the margins of rivers and lakes. They were slender, long-snouted animals equipped with rows of needle-like teeth, well-suited to seizing fish or tearing at flesh. Some seem to have lived partly in water, crocodile style. Others were more terrestrial. They appear on nearly every continent, except perhaps Antarctica and North America. There were also Croniosuchian-type reptiles, armored predators with interlocking bony plates along their backs. These animals, sometimes called Chronosuchians in older literature, looked a lot like crocodiles wrapped in scale mail. Some genera stayed small, but in European Russia, a form called Urolurpaton reached sizes comparable to a modern female American alligator. And then you had the amphibians, not little tree frogs, huge semi-aquatic temnospondyle amphibians that were the terror of rivers and ponds. One family, the Rhynsuchids, included forms that looked somewhat like giant, flattened salamanders with wide heads and sturdy legs. In South Africa, a species called Uranocentrodon could reach around 4 meters in length. It lived in the same regions as big Gorgonopsids and therapsids. Any animal that came to drink at its river risked being dragged under by a mouthful of inward-pointing teeth. In European Russia, other temnospondyls, like Melosaurus, filled a similar niche. These animals could reach roughly 3 meters from snout to tail. They lurked in lakes and slow rivers, waiting to ambush anything foolish enough to approach the water's edge. Even more slender tetrapods existed alongside them. Some, such as various simoriomorph or reptiliomorph lineages, evolved elongated bodies and long tails, reaching 10 feet or so. They may have hunted both in water and on land, adding yet another hazard zone wherever water was present. With all of these predators in play, it's genuinely surprising that herbivores managed to survive at all. Yet the late Permian was full of plant eaters, and many of them evolved elaborate strategies just to avoid being wiped out. Across much of Pangaea, you would have seen dicynodonts, tusked, beak-faced herbivorous therapsids, wandering in herds. One of the most iconic was Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus was only about the size of a badger or a small pig, but it was everywhere. Its body looked odd. A barrel chest, sturdy forelimbs, and a short face with a toothless beak and a pair of tusks. Those strong front limbs were probably used for digging. Many paleontologists think Lystrosaurus spent a lot of time in burrows, hiding from heat, drought, and predators. When the end Permian extinction hit, that burrowing lifestyle might have helped it survive. Burrowing wasn't unique to dicynodonts. Other groups, like early cynodonts and certain small therapsids, also evolved powerful forelimbs and wedge-shaped skulls to excavate tunnels. In a world full of apex killers, going underground was often the best defense. At the opposite end of the herbivore spectrum were the parareptiles known as pariasaurs. These were the tanks of the late Permian. They had broad, heavy bodies, thick limbs, and skulls decorated with bony knobs and spikes. Scutosaurus is the poster child of this group. It weighed more than 1.2 tons and reached lengths comparable to the biggest Gorgonopsids. Its bones were dense and heavily built. Its skin was reinforced with bony plates, and its head carried extra spikes and bosses. Scutosaurus wasn't built to run. It was built to endure. If a large predator attacked it, the animal's best response was to hunker down and let armor and muscle absorb the punishment. In Russia, Scutosaurus and its relatives formed some of the largest bodies on land, rivaling or exceeding the mass of their own predators. Other herbivorous lineages added to the mix. Captorhunids, with multi-road tooth batteries, gnawed on tough vegetation. Various parareptiles and early archosauromorphs browsed low plants or grazed on ground cover. Different dicynodonts, like Cannemyriid-type forms in some regions and smaller relatives elsewhere, occupied niches from burrower to bulk browser. Taken together, late Permian terrestrial ecosystems were packed. You had heavily armored tanks, fast burrowers, semi-aquatic ambushers, sprinting sabre-tooths, venom-suspect therapsids, and crocodile-like reptiles all sharing the same world. For once, the skies did not add much to your list of problems. Unlike the Mesozoic, with its huge pterosaurs and predatory birds, the late Permian air was relatively calm. Giant insects that once ruled the Carboniferous skies had declined after the collapse of those ancient rainforests. You could still find large griffinflies and paleotic Pteropteran insects, but they were rarer and posed no threat to big animals. The only real vertebrate flyers were gliders. Reptiles such as the Wageltosaurids, with long ribs or skin flaps supporting membranes, could glide from tree to tree like oversized flying squirrels. Even the biggest of them was only about the size of a large bat. Annoying if one landed on you, but not remotely lethal. So if you looked up, you were safe. If you looked down at the water, you were in danger. If you looked along the ground, you were almost definitely being watched. And then, on top of the predators, you had the climate to contend with. Large parts of Pangaea were barely habitable. Average global temperatures may have hovered around 35 degrees Celsius, or about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's roughly twice the warmth of today's global average. This heat helped drive extreme aridity in the interior of the supercontinent. Enormous deserts stretched across equatorial regions, where rainfall was scarce and vegetation was patchy at best. If you transported these conditions into the modern world, huge swathes of today's ecosystems would collapse. To the north ran the central Pangaean Mountains, a massive range that stretched across much of the continent's width. They created powerful rain shadows. Regions downwind of the mountains suffered chronic droughts. Only certain basins and river systems, like those in South Africa and parts of Russia, had the combination of water and vegetation needed to support large communities of animals. That's why so many late Permian fossils come from just a few areas. Those places were the rare oases in an otherwise punishing world. As harsh as this climate was, it was still only the warm-up act. Around 252 million years ago, things went from terrible to apocalyptic. In what is now Siberia, a colossal volcanic event began. Over a geologically short span of time, huge volumes of lava erupted onto the surface, building what we now call the Siberian Traps, a region of volcanic rock roughly the size of Western Europe. In some areas, the lava stacks are up to a kilometer thick. These weren't gentle volcanic eruptions. They were sustained outpourings of basaltic lava that released staggering amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur gases into the atmosphere. That greenhouse injection drove global temperatures even higher. Some models suggest that in parts of the world, the average yearly temperature climbed to levels similar to what Death Valley experiences during its hottest month today. Imagine living in that heat all year, with no cool season. At the same time, sulfur gases and other emissions damage the atmosphere in other ways. Evidence from rocks and plant fossils hints that the ozone layer may have been severely compromised. Some estimates propose increases in ultraviolet radiation at the surface of several thousand% in affected regions. If the heat didn't kill you, the UV would start to. Even plants would have struggled under that kind of radiation, further destabilizing food chains. As the gases dissolved into the oceans, they triggered more problems. The extra carbon dioxide led to ocean acidification, making it difficult for many marine organisms to build shells or skeletons. Warming surface waters reduced mixing with deeper layers, helping to create widespread zones of low oxygen. These hypoxic and anoxic events suffocated marine life on a vast scale. By the time the dust and lava finally stopped, Earth was almost a different planet. Around 57% of all biological families are estimated to have gone extinct. Roughly 80+% of known genera vanished. No other mass extinction we know of has been that thorough. For comparison, the asteroid that killed the non-avian dinosaurs wiped out perhaps 17% of families. The end Permian event was in a different league. The oceans, which had felt relatively calm at the start of this story, ended up suffering even more than the land. Heating, acidification, and oxygen loss combined to devastate marine ecosystems. Corals, trilobites, many mollusks, and countless fish lineages vanished. And yet, if you were somehow dropped into this catastrophe and forced to choose where to stand, the water might still have been your best bet. You wouldn't boil instantly. Sea surface temperatures in many places were more like a very hot bath or a jacuzzi than a literal cauldron. it would be miserable, but briefly survivable. On land, by contrast, you were dealing with lethal heat, poisoned air, intense UV, collapsing food webs, and a cast of predators perfectly tuned to exploit anything that looked even slightly alive. For most of Earth's history, the advice to any time traveler is simple: don't go in the water. During the very last moments of the Permian, that advice flips. If you have to exist at all, your best chance is to wade into the strangely quiet seas and hope the jacuzzi-temperature water treats you kindly. Because on Pangaea, in the age of Gorgonopsids, therapsids, giant amphibians, and volcanic hellfire, the land itself felt like it wanted you dead.